Chapter 5, Section 3. Again, I want to remind you about the biggest idea that we're talking about, and that is the idea that Rome became the largest and most powerful empire in the world, and because of that, they contributed a lot of things to cultures around the world. Nothing says that more than Section 3. You're going to see that there are a lot of contributions found in this section. All right, Chapter 5, Section 3, which you're going to take notes on from page 23 to 27 in your packets, is called Culture and Society in the Roman World. First of all, Rome art and architecture was, a lot of those ideas were adopted from Greek, especially certain styles of art. Statues that were displayed in public buildings like the Colosseums, and many of the murals that were produced to use in the private homes were all Greek art styles. Rome had no real copyright issues, and so copies were very popular to have. The Greeks strived for an ideal appearance in their art and architecture, and remember, they strived really for perfection. And the Romans really did not borrow that idea at all from the Greeks. They would rather reproduce realistic appearances. So on the Greece versus Rome comparison chart, we are going to compare the art and architecture. In Greece, as mentioned above, they strived for perfection in their artwork, and Rome strived for realistic appearances. All right, the biggest thing that Rome contributed to the world of art and architecture was the idea of curved lines. They used the arch, which was not invented by the Romans, but by the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. However, because of their excessive use, if you will, of the arch in buildings like the Colosseum and their aqueducts, the Romans are really kind of been given credit for the arch. The vaulted ceilings, as in the cathedrals and so forth, in the Pantheon and in any other Colosseum that's really, or a basilica that's found in ancient Rome. And the dome. And the most perfect example of the dome is in the Pantheon. And again, I just want to remind you that both the arch and the dome were first used by the Sumerians, not the Romans. The Pantheon is a perfect example of that Greco-Roman architecture. The front portion of the Pantheon, found still currently in Rome, is basically a mini version of what Greek temples would look like, with the columns, the symmetry, made out of marble. And the back portion was definitely a Roman idea because it used the dome and the roundness that Romans were well known for building a lot of things that were circular. The picture on the left here is the example of inside the dome. This is a picture of it from the outside, and you can see the skylight here, and this is a picture of the front with the Greek portion of the building.
I didn't see it. Oh, I see it.
Another thing that the Romans used was the idea in their engineering was using concrete on a massive scale. Greeks never really used the idea of concrete, and so the Romans really started to use this idea, and typically they covered the concrete with red bricks and or marble, and so that saved a lot of money on the architecture because nothing was made out of solid marble like the Greeks did. Another good thing to understand about concrete is we have learned a lot about concrete and making it from the Roman concrete. And if you read the little section called Connections Past to Present, found on page 164, that gives you some more insight on what we've actually borrowed from the Romans as far as concrete goes. This is a picture from Pompeii, And you can see that the front portion of this building, or what's left of it, were the marble columns. And then you can see that the side columns were the red brick. Now they weren't like this always, and they were covered with concrete and or marble, and they have just worn down simply because this is a picture from Pompeii, which was covered with volcanic ash for hundreds of years. All right, as far as on the Greece versus Rome comparison chart dealing with architecture, again, they still were striving for perfection for Greece, and more realistic ideas of architecture for Rome are more practical. But remember, Greece was well known for their columns, which were specifically made out of marble. The three types, remember, were Doric, Corinthian, and Ionic. Rome is more well known for the curved lines of the arch, the vault, and the dome, and they used more red brick and concrete. In Greece, you have the Parthenon, and in Rome you have the Colosseum. You also have the Pantheon, which was that perfect blend of both Greek and Roman architectural styles, which is found in Rome today. Another thing that the Romans were well known for as far as art, architecture, and engineering was their brilliance in building roads, bridges, and aqueducts. As far as roads go, they had over 50,000 roads that were built. Anytime Rome conquered a new area, they would immediately build roads so that they could get to and from that location, and of course, trade, get their soldiers there for protection, and obviously just simple transportation. So the saying, all roads lead to Rome, well, that is really literal at this point in time, because of the 50,000 roads, they did literally all eventually lead back to Rome, and so they could get troops in and out from borders to the central location of Rome in a relatively short time. Now, part of the reason why their roads were so well constructed is because of the engineering that went into building each of the roads. So they have layers of sand, gravel, cement mortar, and then on top they had a large drainage ditch along the sides, like we have as far as gutters, and then they topped it with large stone slabs. And because of their great construction, you can see this picture found in Pompeii today of how great the roads look even today. Now, the Romans constructed about 53,000 miles of roads, and our U.S. highway system has only 42,000 miles. So we think we have a lot of roads, but the Romans constructed a lot more roads than we do. Now, we do have other roads that are not included in the highway system, but if we just took the highway system, clearly the Romans would beat us in that competition. Now, the 53,000 miles of roads also would be more than twice the circumference of the Earth. Now, that's a lot of roads. Taking a look at this map, you can see all of the roads that encompass the Roman Empire across 3 continents. The teal green roads were the ones that were the imperial borders, so those were not necessarily roads, but those were borders. And then all of the red lines, some of the purple lines, and even some of the gray lines were roads that were constructed. The red ones tended to be more of the main ones, and you can see that they do all go back to Rome eventually. Now, you of course have to cross bodies of water, but the Romans were also very good at constructing bridges. All right, the other thing that we mentioned besides bridges and roads were aqueducts. And the aqueducts are channels that look like bridges, but basically they were structures that carried water to all the distant locations in the Roman Empire, and the water was channeled across the top portion. And of course they use a lot of engineering to get the water to flow where they needed it to go. And also you can see the wide use of the aqueducts, or of the arches in the aqueducts. There's lots of other pictures in your book, but in On page 147, you can see probably one of the more famous aqueducts, which is still located in France, called the Pont du Gard. Another style of art were the mosaics, and these were tiled pictures. And the mosaics are, a lot of them were religious, but not all of them. So some examples of mosaics that are found in your book. On page 167, there's a picture of the gladiatorial fights that are mosaics with using the small tiles to make a design or a picture. And on 178, there's one of Emperor Constantine. These two pictures here were actually floors, mosaic floors in Pompeii. Another style of art were murals, and murals are basically paintings on the wall. The Romans didn't have canvas or any kind of paintings like that where they would hang them on the walls, so they painted directly on the walls. They're also called frescoes. Both of these paintings are located in Pompeii. The picture on the right just depicts a portrait of the family that lived in the home, and on the left you can see the vivid colors that still exist from the city of Pompeii. Other examples of murals, page 151 in your book was an Etruscan mural, 162 was another one from Pompeii, and so is 165, and then on 172 there is a mural of Christian disciples. Moving on to Roman literature, there were a few people that we need to mention that were Roman writers, and the first one is Virgil, and he wrote the Aeneid, and the Aeneid was one of those epic long poems, and it was about the character of Aeneas, who portrayed the characteristics of the ideal Roman, and the Aeneid is still read today in a lot of world literature classes, so that's why it would be a contribution. Another Roman literature writer was Horace, and Horace wrote what was known as the satires, and those satires were exactly what it sounds like. They made fun of the weaknesses that the human beings had in Rome, and they did have a lot. The third person was Livy, and Livy wrote the history of Rome, and this was actually 142 books that traced throughout the history of Rome. Unfortunately, it was not always very accurate, but it did mention just how fabulous and great Rome was, and it just depicted the real perception that people had of Rome about how great it was, even though it wasn't always great. There's an excerpt talking about the book on page 165, and it's the preface, and it goes like this. The study of history is the best medicine for a sick mind, for in history you have a record of the infinite variety of human experiences plainly set out for all to see. And in that record, you can find for yourself and your country both examples and warnings. Fine things to take as models, base things, and rotten through and through to avoid. All right, as far as literature on our Greece versus Rome comparison chart, we're going to compare people and or compare pieces of literature. So if you can remember back from the Greek unit, we mentioned quite a few writers in Greek history. Some of them wrote history, some of them wrote comedies, some of them wrote poetry, some of them wrote the tragedies or plays, and so anyone that you can remember. A lot of people tend to remember Homer, you can remember Euripides, you can remember Aristophanes, you can remember Herodotus, whoever it happens to be. In Rome, of course, you have Virgil, Horace, and Livy. And as far as literature goes, some examples of Greek literature that are well known, the Iliad, the Odyssey, both written by Homer, and the story called the Trojan Women, or the Oedipus Rex, written as far as a tragedy. And Rome, you have the Aeneid, the satires, and the history of Rome. Continuing on with Chapter 5, Section 3, Part 2, the Roman family. The Roman family were headed by a dominant male, and that was called paterfamilias. and that consisted of a husband, the wife or wives, children, unmarried daughters, and slaves. And that, of course, was for the wealthy, would have the slaves. Um, Children were raised at home and also educated at home, which was not like the Greeks who sent them to schools, especially the upper class. As far as education is mentioned, they were educated at home by the fathers, and then later on the wealthy Romans had Greek slaves that tutored them. As far as what they learned, they of course learned to read, mostly in Latin, but sometimes in Greek as well. They learned to write. They learned moral principles and family values. They studied law, physical training. At 16, boys kind of reached their manhood, if you would, and so they got to trade in their purple edged toga for just a plain white one, which was the male version of the toga. And daughters were taught by private tutors, or they would send them to a primary school. The attitudes towards women, well, they changed, but at first women needed male guardians no matter where they were at. Most of the time that was their husband, but it could be a brother as well. There were arranged marriages, and typically girls got married anywhere from 12 to 14 and boys usually around 14. And divorce was allowed. However, the roles did start to change for men and women, and fathers could no longer sell his children or have them put to death. Women did not require to have their guardians as they did early on. And the upper class women really, of course, had more rights than the lower class women. They could own, inherit, and sell property. They were also not segregated from males in the home like the Greek women were. Roman women could attend races, theaters, and events in the amphitheater. However, they were still segregated in those locations, so men and women did not sit together in those. Now, they could not really ever be elected or run the government, or even participate in politics. However, the wives of the emperors tended to have a lot of power, and they influenced how their husbands ran the empire. Slavery was huge in ancient Rome, and as a matter of fact, slaves outnumbered common people in ancient Rome. Slavery, of course, was very common in all ancient times, but so much so that it gave Rome almost too much unemployment because they didn't think that it was necessary to hire somebody if they could have a slave that was for free. The Greek slaves were in higher demand because they were educated and they tended to tutor their children. And different nationality slaves were used for different things. For example, it was the Hebrew slaves that constructed the Colosseum, for example. And so different nationalities were used either as household slaves, servants, or other building projects. And there's a quote that said, it was cheaper to work a slave to death and replace them than to treat them well. So that just gave you the idea of how many slaves there were in ancient Rome. Now, there were a few revolts, not a whole lot, surprisingly, considering they outnumbered the free Roman citizen. But in 773 BC, Spartacus, who was a gladiator, led a revolt that involved 70,000 slaves, and this occurred in southern Italy. Unfortunately, Spartacus and his followers did not prevail, and he, as well as 6,000 of his followers, were killed by crucifixion, which of course means nailing to a cross, and that occurred 2 years after their revolt began. And again, crucifixion was a common form of capital punishment in ancient Rome. And of course, it was meant to display to others that, this is what's going to happen if you choose to do the same thing. Most of the daily life that we know about Roman Empire was because of the city of Pompeii. And there's lots of information about Pompeii, and as a matter of fact, I have a book and several other things about Pompeii that could help you figure out what daily life was like in the Roman Empire. Rome had the largest population of the empire. In Rome alone, by Caesar Augustus's time, there was 1 million people living in the city of Rome. The living conditions were, as expected, not so good. It was overcrowded. It was very noisy because of the overcrowdedness. Carts for trading and transportation could not maneuver during the daytime, so they could only move at nighttime. It was very dangerous to live in Rome because there was a lot of crime due to the unemployment, and also there were lots of fires. A lot of these fires occurred in these massive apartment buildings because they were mostly constructed out of wood. Just to give you some perspective about how big Rome was in this time. Now, remember, we're talking about, 100 BC, let's just say, as a time frame that we're talking about, where there was 1 million people. Today there's about 3.4 million, which of course is bigger, but you got to compare it to then to now, and that is quite enormous. There's a huge difference between the rich and the poor. The rich lived in villas, and these villas or homes looked similar to what this picture is here. It was very elaborate, and it had mosaic, tiled floors, it had paintings, it had all sorts of different rooms. Some of those rooms they had a kitchen, which of course was exactly what we use it for because the word kitchen is a Latin word. They had bedrooms typically, but at least one. They had an atrium, which is the central courtyard you can see here. This atrium is really a place that they would gather. They had a reception room, that's the tablinum, and that of course was for all the guests that came to their homes, and the triclinium, which was a dining room, and they had lavish feasts where they ate all sorts of wild animals and fruits and vegetables, unlike the poor. And at the top, they typically had a compluvium, which was a hole in the roof, and its main purpose was, just like it sounds, to collect water. That's why you would have a hole in the roof. The poor had it not quite as good. They did not live in villas. They lived in insulae. And in the city of Rome, there were massive apartment buildings. And so the Romans were really the first people to build or construct apartment buildings. These insulae tended to be 6 stories high, and because there were so many of them, they kind of look like islands from an aerial view, and so that's where they get the name of insulae. They were constructed out of concrete and wood, so the walls were concrete and the floors were made out of wooden beams, which made them a huge fire hazard, and they were often poorly built and they collapsed, and most landlords didn't care to maintain them because it tended to be cheaper to rebuild than to fix things. Because they were overcrowded, because they had wooden beam floors, there was always a threat of fire. And probably the worst fire in ancient Roman history was in 64 AD, and this destroyed a huge portion of the city of Rome. And at that point, Nero was the emperor. And if you remember back from section 2, we talked about him being accused of starting it and not doing anything to stop the fire because he wanted to construct some buildings. So he thought if they were gone, he could build some other things that would have his name on it. And of course, then he in turn blamed the Christians for that fire and persecuted them for that. There was high rent for these apartments, so many families lived in one room. There was no plumbing or central heating, which the heating not a big deal because of living in the Mediterranean climate, but the plumbing was a huge deal. So much so that they would literally dump garbage and human waste from the windows, and if you just happen to be walking by, you could be dumped on, so to speak. Public programs. A lot of the things constructed in ancient Rome gave this appearance that the city of Rome was fantastic, that everything in Rome was beautiful, perfect, elaborate, magnificent, and things were really good in Rome. But in essence, a lot of those masked the true existence in Rome. The emperors, starting with Augustus, was actually felt responsible to provide food for the poor, and so you could stand in line and get free grain. And so during Augustus's time, 200,000 people would receive free grain. And so because of this lifestyle of many people unemployed, many people living in overcrowded city of Rome, and trying to receive some of this free food, entertainment was used in ancient Rome as a distraction. They had religious festivals, which of course would coincide with all of the gods and goddesses that they had, but they also had a lot of games. And some of those games were performed in the Circus Maximus. Now, the Circus Maximus does not exist today, and I'll show you some pictures in a little bit, but the name Circus Maximus comes from the Latin word for the circular shape of the arena. And so the word circus, of course, meant more the circular shape. We use the word circus today, but not necessarily to mean round. It was the oldest arena built in Rome, and it could seat 200,000. Both men and women could sit together, which was unlike the Colosseum and other locations. The floor was made of sand, just like the Colosseum, and that was mostly to absorb blood of animals and humans. Because it was much larger, they could have horse and chariot races. They did some long-distance running. They staged army battles in time of peace so that the soldiers could stay on top of their game. They also had boxing and wrestling matches. Now, the picture at the bottom is, and actually the top right, are computer-generated pictures of what we believe it to look like when it was in its entirety. You can see it's more of an oval shape, and at the far end of the top right picture was the stables where the horses were kept, and the arch was used in the entrance, and of course the elaborate seating was for the 200,000 people. Now the picture on the top left is all that's left of the Circus Maximus today in ancient or in modern day Rome. It's basically a dirt track, and that's the only thing that's actually left today. The most famous building in Rome, though, is the Flavian Amphitheater. And of course, that still exists today. This was much smaller and could only seat 50,000. And you probably do not know it by the name of the Flavian Amphitheater, but that, of course, was named after the last name of the emperor that was constructing it and his sons that completed it. But it was called the Colosseum, or nicknamed the Colosseum, because of the huge colossus or statue of Nero that was next to it. Now today, the statue of Nero does not exist, but the nickname still sticks. Vespasian was the emperor that started the construction, and unfortunately he did not live to see it completed in 80 AD, and it was finished during his son Titus's reign. The Hebrews were the ones that constructed it, so the Hebrew slaves were the ones that built it, and it was made out of marble that was covering red brick and concrete, as we mentioned before, and there are also iron rods that supported the building as well to make it more sturdy. It was 4 stories tall, and all of those stories used the arch concept in its construction. There was also a catwalk at the top, which typically would have a sharpshooter to kill any animals that tended to get out of control, or gladiators that tried to escape, or those kind of things. And there was also a net to protect the spectators, and also a shade over the top to protect the visitors from the beating down of the sun in ancient Rome. There were wood seats for the lower class and marble seats for the upper class. And there were 26 entrances, and it was said that you could get in and out of the Colosseum with the 50,000 people in 5 minutes. And of course, this is the most famous arena for the gladiatorial fights, and the gladiators who were fighters were usually slaves or criminals, and somebody had to die, and so either people or animals or both. And these are some pictures of what the Colosseum looked like in its entirety. Okay, so we ended with section 2 talking about the Colosseum, and the 2 pictures here are again good examples of what they believe the Colosseum to look like in its entirety. So the picture on the left, you can see the Colossus of Nero next to it. You can also see at the top the pillars or the apparatuses that hold the canopy across the top. The picture on the right, you can see all of the arches. And then within each of those arches, there were also statues, and those don't exist today either. These are the pictures of Rome and the Colosseum today. The one on the bottom is, of course, from the outside of it, so you can see even the 4 stories are not in complete existence today. And the 2 pictures at the top are examples of what the Colosseum looks like on the inside. On the left, you can see at the forefront there that they have reconstructed what they believe the floor to look like. On the top right one, you can see they've reconstructed some of the marble seats off to the right. And the Colosseum was one of those things that was, again, used red brick, concrete, and so that has not really endured very well. On the outside, however, was used with marble, and so that's why the outside remains pretty intact today. The one thing that doesn't, you can kind of see right here, you can see some of the holes in the outside, and that's mostly because of the iron rods that were in the Colosseum. The iron rods were taken out to use for other construction projects. The Colosseum was also supposedly flooded and used for mock navy battles, and just like the Circus Maximus was used for mock army battles, the navy battles were done in the Colosseum. There again, you can see the holes on the top left picture, and the channels on the far right are some of the locations of where the gladiators would be below the floor, and also how the water was taken in and out. And the bottom picture is a good example of the catwalk and the shade that went over the Colosseum. All right, so let's review section 3. The author of the Aeneid and one of the Roman literature writers was B. Virgil. Some good examples of Roman engineering skills was E. Roads, bridges, and aqueducts. A kind of family where the male is dominant is paterfamilia. The apartments for the poor were called insulae, Latin word, and the form of execution that was common in Rome, crucifixion. C. In 73 BC, the gladiator Spartacus. B. Led a slave revolt. Upper-class Roman women did all of the following except which one? That would be A. Marry after age 20. They married much sooner than 20. Slavery was common in the ancient world. Streets in Rome were all of the following except which one? That would be D. Filled with carts during the day. Remember, the carts could only go at night. And Roman sculptors created statues that B. were very real.